Good evening, everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful evening wherever you might be. Welcome to Caribbean Bridges. My name is Justin Ram, and I'm sitting in for my great friend, Julian Rogers, who decided that this weekend he wanted a weekend off, and I, being the glutton for punishment, agreed to do that for him. However, there's really no punishment in me doing this evening, since I'm going to be discussing the very important topic of COVID-19 and the economy. It's a very important topic for us because let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, one of these we need to eradicate, but the other we really need to think about how we resuscitate. And I am really privileged this evening to have assembled a great list of guests to help me discuss this very important topic with you. So let me just introduce each of them in the meantime. First up, I have who I consider to be a true economic visionary of our region. She is Therese Turner Jones, and she's a country manager for the Inter-American Development Bank. Welcome, Therese.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Happy to be here.
Great. Secondly, I have a good friend of mine who I consider to be one of the brightest economists in the region and who I also know is a fellow libertarian. He has also recently started up a health tech company called Medal. Let me introduce you to Kiran Mathur Mohammed.
Hi, Justin. Happy to be part of the libertarian conspiracy.
Thank you, Kiran. And last by no means least, I have who's also a dear friend of mine and whom I consider to be the region's preeminent expert on trade. She is Dr. Jan-Yves Remy, who is the Deputy Director of the Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy and Services at the UWI Cave Hill campus. Welcome, Jan-Yves.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction, but I'll take it. It's Saturday. Thanks for having us.
Exactly. Well, it's Saturday, and I'm keeping you all away from a glass of wine. So, all introductions need to be very generous, but they are true. So I really want to get straight into the discussion with all three of you. Now, we're going to be discussing this very important topic of the COVID-19 and its impact on our economies. We all know that it has been really tough for us in the Caribbean. Most of our economies have declined maybe by double digits all over the Caribbean, except perhaps for Guyana, which I think I really want to use this statistic to actually help our audience members understand how bad it has really been. Before COVID-19, Guyana's economy was scheduled to grow by 80% in 2020. And when COVID hit, it only grew by about 30%. So COVID has actually knocked off about 50 percentage points off of growth for Guyana. So could you imagine what that has also meant for the rest of the Caribbean? So in addition to GDP declining, we have had debt levels rising, massive layoffs and high unemployment. It's been really, really tough. And just to remind each of y'all, in about 4 months' time, all Mother Nature is coming around with that hurricane season. And we can only hope that we are not hit by any severe hurricanes this year. But anyway, today, I don't want to speak only about the gloomy economy. We really need to speak about how we resuscitate our economies going forward. And so, Therese, earlier I said that you are, in my mind, one of our leading economic visionaries for the Caribbean. You, of course, have a wonderful vantage point from where you sit at the IDB. Please tell us, what has COVID really meant for our economies, and how do you think we need to adjust in order to get out of this?
You painted a picture already of how grim the reality has been, right? So double-digit declines in GDP throughout this region, and the tourism economies, of course, got hit even more so than the commodity-dependent ones. So if you want to separate Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Eastern Caribbean from the commodity producers like Guyana, which you just referenced, even though they took a big hit from the projections, right? Not even 80, the projection was actually 85%. It went down to 53, and then it went finally to around 30. So we're all feeling the economic fallout of that. tourism as an industry globally has been the single industry to, be decimated around the world. So it's not just our region, but it's around the world. So it's been grim. Now, having said that, what we did see too in 2020, what we're seeing now in 2021, is how quickly commerce, as well as some governments, have moved to the digital world, right? And Justin, you rightly say that I've been on this idea for a long time now to say that the region really needs to sort of digitize itself to be more modern, to be more competitive, to keep up. So we saw a lot of that in 2020. We continue to see more of that. I think that's one of the pathways to recovery. And of course, the other pathway is to look towards greening of our economies. And what do I mean by that? We know that we've spent, most of the last 50 odd years totally dependent on fossil fuels. And we've also known that for the last 20 odd years, we've been trying to diversify our energy mix. So this is a good opportunity to look to renewable energy, whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's thermal, whether it's, waves. There are all kinds of ways in which we can do that. But of course, it's easier said than done, because I think we have to separate how we move in the short term to recover and what could be a medium to long-term path out of this, what I call economic calamity. Justin, just this morning, as I'm watching the news out of Texas, and I must say, this word weatherize has become like it's a term to say that you've made your infrastructure more resilient, at least for the Texans. But I keep thinking about our region, because you mentioned it, and that in a few months we're going to be back into hurricane season, and let's hope that and pray that it will be as mild as 2020, but we can't ever predict that correctly. So think about how we build infrastructure now, because that's another way out of this economic mess, right? So we know that in our region, you know this from your previous work, and we know this from all the capital budgets that we see shrinking around the region, that investing in smart, resilient infrastructure could also be one of those bridges to a better looking economy when this pandemic is behind us. But I think we also have to, especially given that this is a widely broadcast discussion this afternoon, and even though it's a Saturday afternoon, we don't want to be too grim, but I think it's important for us we can't sort of not live the reality we're in, which is until we're all vaccinated to a sufficient degree, it's going to be a long haul. So this pathway I'm describing is also contingent on us having access to the vaccines quickly and massively. So 16% of the population is not yet at it. It needs to be 60% of the population. So there's a lot to do there. I'll stop there because I know others have views on this, but I think there are clear pathways to the future that look better, but we have this reality that we're stuck with right now. We need to get on with how to mitigate the impact of even worsening declines on our GDP and on our human capital, and get on with it.
Yeah. No, thank you, Therese, for that great overview of what's been happening. And you've actually provided us with a wonderful segue to speak about vaccinations. Kiran, 2 weeks ago, both of us, we wrote an article in the Newsday newspaper in Trinidad and Tobago, which then went sort of viral around the Caribbean about the need for us to really consider mass vaccinations, because it's the only way we're going to get out of all of these lockdowns. Tell me, why is that important? And is there some way for us to consider how we finance this mass vaccination of our region?
Well, Justin, I think this is the single biggest challenge that is facing the region right now. There is nothing else but this, because right now we only have access to vaccines via COVAX, which is a facility that allows Caribbean governments to obtain vaccines for up to 20% of the population. There are some sort of bilateral discussions happening, of course, India, in Barbados, and in other parts of the Caribbean, and some discussions with the African Union. But the plain fact of the matter is we are massively short of the 90% of vaccines and vaccination capacity required in order to reopen. As of right now, the situation is very dire, and regional governments are saying that it will take us until 2023 to reach herd immunity. What that means is that life in 2020 is going to keep being, if you've lived through 2020, I think we've all had like fairly harrowing experiences. Of course, some worse than others. But the reality is, I think no one of us wants to go through what we went through last year again. And we're going to have a repeat of it. It's going to be like Groundhog Day again this year. And yeah, I mean, and next year as well, unless we get our acts together.
Yes.
But Justin, I mean, in terms of financing, I mean, Therese sort of, it's fantastic that she is here as well, because I know the IDB has been an integral part to the financing of COVID-19 solutions, specifically CARFA, the Caribbean institution, which has been managing the response. But really, this is a case where cooperation is absolutely critical, because we need all of the Caribbean governments to come together and as one and order vaccines. And by the way, not wait for WHO approval to order vaccines, because by the time that happens, everyone else has already gotten ahead of us in the queue. We need to order the vaccines before that approval arrives, obviously for responsible late stage candidates, but before that approval has arrived. And individually, one tiny country, one tiny island is not going to get recognition from the big vaccine companies who are getting calls from prime ministers of big countries. We need to do this as a group. This is our time for regional integration.
Great. Karan, thanks so much for that. And I couldn't agree more. We really need to consider how we go about this whole process of mass vaccinations. One of the challenges I've been hearing recently is that we seem to have a lot of vaccination sentiment around the region as well. Recently, Barbados received a donation of vaccines from India. And I think I really want to make it clear to all of the listening public that those vaccines that we got from India is actually called Covishield, but it is the same vaccine as the AstraZeneca, which was developed out of the Oxford University in the United Kingdom. But I think we're going to have a real challenge on our hands to ensure that we get up to that vaccination, to that percentage whereby we can consider that we have herd immunity. Now, Janives, we heard Karan speaking about the need for us to come together and to vaccinate. Maybe it's easier for us if we could perhaps procure all of the vaccines at the same time in CARICOM. I don't know. It's a difficult situation. But recently I saw where the World Trade Organization, somewhere where you have previously worked, they're actually now going to have a new head of the WTO. A fantastic woman. Her name is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And what really struck me in her first interview was she said that her priority at the WTO would be to ensure that there's vaccine equality. Now, you are the trade expert, and I'm trying to figure out, what does the WTO have to do with vaccines now, and what role do they play? Why is trade so important in this?
Right. Thanks again, Justin, for the opportunity. So before I answer your question, I just want to record that, the selection and final clearance for Ngozi has been long awaited, and it's a great momentous occasion for those of us of color. So the Africa and the Africa diaspora, which I count the Caribbean as, and also the first woman Now, Ngozi, and I take some liberties because, spelling out her name is very difficult for us. So she has ascended the throne, let's say, finally, thanks to the Biden administration's acceptance of her after we had heard that, Trump and Lighthizer had, decided not to form the consensus for her selection. But she comes to the WTO at a very fortuitous time for her and the WTO. One, you ask what the WTO has to do with all of this. Well, first of all, the WTO is sort of the place where all the trade and the rules for trade happen. And it has taken quite a fundamental role, even if notional, when the lockdown started. So with all of these export restrictions we saw happening, the shutdown of the economy, obviously that has trade impacts. And so the WTO really started an aggressive campaign, even if at the time it was leaderless, to sort of at least track and try to get governments and members of the WTO to sit together and try to commit not to have these export restrictions and other trade restricting impacts because of COVID. So food supplies, medical supplies. So the WTO has asserted itself in this space. Now, speaking about vaccines in particular, the reason I say it's fortuitous is because we know that Ngozi is the chair. And in fact, her previous position was chair of the Gavi Alliance. And Gavi, as we know, is the vaccination alliance that is working with the WHO to facilitate the COVAX and the ACT Accelerator program so that developing countries and least developed countries have access to the vaccine. Now, the reason it becomes very, very critical to WTO is because we have something at the WTO called the agreements relating to trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And what that means is that the WTO sort of has to ensure, because of that TRIPS agreement, that IP rights are respected. One of the WTO members, in fact, two, South Africa and India, brought before the Council suggestions that IP rights should be waived in order to ensure that the manufacturing capacity, because I think Kieran was talking about the fact that CARICOM should come together and finance the option. We have a problem that is broader than that, which is of supply. And so what you have is that there are some countries who have secured their supply through bilateral agreements with these major manufacturing capacity companies, but most of the countries like ours do not have these bilateral arrangements. So what the South Africans and the Indians want is to waive intellectual property rights of these pharmaceutical companies so you can have compulsory licensing in order to ensure that countries that have no manufacturing capacity can source these vaccines from manufacturers in countries that are willing to export to them. So in a sense, it would mean you have to ensure that these vaccines are procured, but potentially by waiving IP rights. Now, what Ngozi has said is, we do not want to see that. We do not want to see that happen because there's a delicate balance between ensuring that pharmaceutical companies want to innovate and obviously having equitable distribution. So she has said that there should be a third way, and she hasn't really described what that should be, but at least get all the members to come together and figure out a solution. And we're seeing now with the G7 announcement yesterday that bigger countries are saying that they will ensure after their domestic capacity and their domestic the domestic situation is secured, then they will sort of ensure that developing countries have access to these vaccines. So just in a nutshell, the WTO, I think, because of the personality of Ngozi and her previous, work with Gavi, will take this on. But I think it will be more of an advocacy role that Ngozi will play in order to bring all of the big guns together. And there's very little likelihood, I think, that waiver of IP rights will happen, but she'll try a third way to get everybody to agree to some kind of arrangement where those without the manufacturing capacity and who are outside of these deals with the big pharmaceutical companies get access to the vaccines. Thanks.
Well, it sounds to me like we're very fortunate as world citizens to have Ngozi in that very important position. Anyway, this is Caribbean Bridges, and I am Justin Ram with you this evening. So coming back to discuss this topic, Therese, so of course, vaccination is really important for us to help us get out of this quagmire that we're currently in. But we really don't want to return to normalcy, do we? We don't want to go back to where we were, because I think you mentioned it, Therese, that as a region, we were already in a sort of a bad patch before this. And Therese, I know that you're probably the biggest advocate, and you said it earlier, for digitalization in the region. And we have made some progress over this COVID period. And do you think that that's still critical for us? And why? Why is that so important?
But before I go there, I just want to make a comment because it came to me as Jan was talking about vaccines and access. So just to say, I think, because what I know of the world of COVAX and where we are now is that it's going to be very, very difficult to have more supply, as you mentioned, on a bilateral basis. If CARICOM can come together and we figure out a way to have access as a group, I think that could work. But it's a little late, and when these discussions were started in the middle of last year and the IDB was in the middle of trying to get all the countries to sign on and so on, that was probably the time to go at it as a group. And again, we're caught on our back foot, Justin, because we didn't go at it as a group, right? And so we're paying for that again. So I think there's a lesson there. Very happy about Ngozi. I was on a committee with her. She was on the task force that PM Motley put together on CARICOM all of last year and the year before we worked together. So I'm very proud of that. And I think she's going to be a huge, huge, huge advocate for developing countries and far regions. So just want to shout out to her too. On your question of, where are we? And definitely there's no going back to 2019 because this region we know has been one of the laggards in terms of technology adoption and adaptation and so on. If you look at all of the manufacturing plants throughout this region, very few of them, less than a third, have R&D, research and development arms to the institutions, so they're not innovating to the extent that they should. We know because we deal with government agencies as citizens every single day. We know that our region is also too paper-based. We still need too much paper to get the simplest transaction done. We know that sometimes it takes more than one visit to an agency to get that single transaction done. In fact, Jamaica is on average, it's the country where you're more likely to be frustrated by having to make up to 8 visits sometimes to get one transaction done. And so we need to speed that up. We need to make sure that government can deliver, driver's licenses, birth certificates, all these things that we need, whether it's to authenticate ourselves so that we can do a financial sector transaction or open up a business. We need more tech. We need more instant ways of doing things. And by the way, every Caribbean person knows this because we know how easy it is to do business in other countries. We travel to the US, we go to Canada, we go to the UK. We know how simple it can be to do some transactions, but somehow we are prepared to stand in line in multiple government agencies to carry out the same transactions. That has to change. We cannot go back there. And happily, with or without IDB support, several countries in the region are making big headways there. And I think that will help us be more competitive. That'll help us be more customer-centric. It's not, if only public servants will see their jobs as to facilitate economic activity, to make the public get what they need quicker, to be more service-oriented, to deliver on what they're supposed to deliver. And so we need to keep accelerating in that vein. And I think, as you know, technology and all of its uses growing at an exponential rate is the way to do that because you can scale up quickly, things are much more efficient, government can get savings, and every citizen to be happy. So we need to see more of that, and there's no turning back to pre-COVID days in terms of what our citizens want. And what we've seen, of course, in 2020 is many places have adapted, even in the private sector. So the fact that you can order your groceries online in Jamaica and have it delivered in a couple of hours, that was unheard of in 2019. But now businesses are offering those services because to stay relevant, to stay in business, they need to be able to adapt in order to stay in touch with their customers. And I'm seeing that all over the region. It's not just in Jamaica or in the Bahamas where I experienced that over the Christmas holidays. We are adapting, we're adjusting. Look at the health sector, and of course, Kiran can talk more about this.
Yeah.
But imagine if telemedicine was the norm, right? Imagine how many people might not have been exposed to the virus if they didn't have to go into a doctor's office or present themselves physically at clinics, public clinics, if they felt ill. If you could have that visit by Skype or on a computer or even on a telephone, that would make things so much easier. So I think we're going there. Justin, I'm really, really, really encouraged. And I'm
Okay.
encouraged because we, as you said, it's no turning back. And once we've had a taste of that, we're not going to go back.
Yeah. Now, Therese, you're absolutely correct. Yeah? And I've experienced it recently. As you know, I've branched off to become an entrepreneur myself, and so I've experienced it firsthand how difficult it can be to start a business, and all of the paperwork that's still required. I was lamenting to some friends that I know that, for example, in the United Kingdom, I can register a business over there certainly in less than 1 hour, and I would have my certificates sent to me electronically. But I remember trying to do that recently in the region, and it took me weeks to do. I had to get all of the forms notarized, and so I know I do feel the pain right now, and I hope that we move towards this digital revolution, and it is here to stay. Now, I think that's a really lovely way for me to ask Kiran, because Kiran, you are actually in the belly of the beast when it comes to starting up a business and really understanding why is it important for us to go digital. You have recently started up your health technology firm, Medal. Could you tell us what is Medal? What is it about, and why did you decide to do this? And while you were setting it up, what were some of the challenges that you faced in trying to do that?
Sure. I mean, of course, Justin. I mean, I think Therese really sort of spoke to it very clearly. And in terms of COVID-19 is forcing us to adapt. And the only way we can do that is using technology and driving technology. But I mean, Justin, and I'm sure this has been your experience with starting up GSEC. But the interesting thing, you mentioned some of the problems and difficulties. It is very hard. It is way harder to start a company in Trinidad, for example, or in any Caribbean country than, for example, if we were in Europe, if we were in San Francisco. But also that actually, what I've come to realize very begrudgingly almost, is that that's almost one of its strengths. Because we have so many problems here, that if you're willing to really sit down and do the legwork, you can really actually say, hang on, we can solve these problems for people like us, people in developing countries. And if we can solve the problems for people like us, and we can really help the most vulnerable in society, not just in Trinidad, not just in Jamaica or the rest of the Caribbean, but actually take that and help people throughout the developing world. So what we've been doing is, it sort of started just before COVID-19, and what Medal does is we allow doctors to electronically prescribe to patients, and then patients can then access their prescriptions through our app, which we then fill and deliver through our own in-house pharmacy. And because we can cut down a lot of the costs involved in that, that means we don't charge the patients for delivery and don't charge the doctors for the use of the app. By doing so, what we can really do is several things. One, we solve the problem that 1 in 2 prescriptions are never filled, which is a huge issue, given that half of the Caribbean populations are suffering from diabetes and heart disease, chronic care issues. But the second thing is COVID-19. I mean, Therese said it absolutely crucially. I mean, with healthcare, we need to seriously and fully rethink how we are delivering healthcare in order to protect our most vulnerable, the immunocompromised. because particularly since it seems that unless we can really strongly cooperate on vaccine procurement, there are a lot of our most vulnerable. We're seeing the surge in Jamaica. We're seeing what's happening in Barbados. A lot of our most vulnerable are still at risk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kiran. And Metal sounds really, really interesting. And I invite all of our viewers to certainly check out your app and your website to see what beautiful work you've been doing there. I hope that it becomes available throughout the Caribbean, because, as Therese said, that's a type of service we need to become much more digitalized. So that's really wonderful. Now, I know that we are here and we're probably singing to the converted about the wonders of technology. Now, Janice, I seem to be asking you some difficult questions, and this one is going to be a little bit difficult as well, because I think all of you would understand that over the last 4 or 5 years, we saw this increase in populism with respect to many of our established democracies around the world. And there have been many commentators who have said that the reason for this push towards populism was always around the strive towards globalization, as well as the advent of technology and the impact that has been having on traditional jobs. So, Janice, from where you sit, how do we now convince what is probably a bit of a skeptical population out there that we still need to go down this digitalization path?
Right. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think I don't even think that it's really a question anymore of convincing. I mean, one of the ironies of, this populism and backlash epitomized by the likes of President Trump is that he used technology most, effectively to get his message out. And I think it's a generational issue, thinking about the intricacy of technology in our lives. I don't think you would go to anybody in the present generation and question how important technology and thinking about it really in terms of social media, etc., how integral that is as part of our lives. And I think, as the two previous speakers said, it's a question of technology making our lives easier, making it better, making things more accessible. The point of entry that I kind of want to start from is thinking about it in a macro e-commerce sort of framework, which is where I come in as a trade expert. So the intricacy of trade and technology right now is unquestionable. At the WTO, there's a discussion about how to frame the rules that will guide international commerce, because quite apart from what was mentioned before about how important it is in making people's lives easier at a domestic level, it is now an engine for trade. E-commerce, the numbers in e-commerce are something like $28 trillion worth of trade now. So the real question for the Caribbean is, where do we situate ourselves in that broader landscape of possibilities? And I think examples like Kiran's are really the ones we need to track and the ones that we need to follow, thinking way back from our education system and how we get digitally minded and software and all of the different ways that we can conceptualize technology. How do we get that on the agenda, and how do we use the tools made available as a result of technology to advance our society? So there's two ways that I sort of look at it. One is at the government level, all of these moves towards digital transformation financed by the IDB, the World Bank. The Eastern Caribbean has gotten a huge amount of money in order to advance its technology and its digital transformation. But there's some basic things that have to underpin that and undergird it, like access to the internet. I mean, there's not even internet access across the Caribbean. So there's still a place and a role for government to ensure that the underlying infrastructure is there in order to enable these e-commerce possibilities to happen. Payment systems, thinking, of how we actually get the value to remain in the Caribbean, because when we use these international platforms, ultimately we use that using third-party platforms, and so as a result, we don't retain a lot of the value. Education, as I mentioned, a lot of the software that we use to undergird our technology in the region is still being used by, we're still using outsiders. So how do we ensure that the software development is retained in the Caribbean? Because this is what is powering our technological societies and our digital transformation. So how do we keep more of that within the region? And the last thing I wanted to mention was really thinking about our place in the discussion of the rules that will form the basis for international e-commerce. So at the WTO now, there is something called a plurilateral discussion happening. It's not done formally under the aegis of the WTO because not all members want to be part of the discussion. But the real interest for the Caribbean is thinking about how we ensure that trade rules that are supposed to facilitate the transfer of data across different countries, etc., how do we extract value from that? Right now, we have a lot of the bigger countries like the United States, China, and the EU dominating the discussions. They have a lot of interest in that. How do we ensure, for instance, that data localization requirements do not work out, without our benefits, outside of our benefits? How do we ensure that payment systems and the rules for payment systems are in our benefit and to our advantage? So I think really where we are now is really thinking about how to craft the broader environment for e-commerce rules so that our people actually benefit from these rules that are being crafted by the broader membership of the WTO.
Wow. Thanks, Genevieve, and that was really, really comprehensive. And it has me thinking that we really need to come together as a region to try to solve some of these problems. Last week, I actually participated in the Africa Digital Finance Summit, and I was on a panel with an entrepreneur out of Nigeria. And of course, he was saying how he was able to grow his business, certainly within Nigeria. Now he's all over Asia, he's all over Africa as well. But it first started off in his home country. Now, with a country with 100 million plus people, you can grow your business quite easily. Now, Therese, you're in Jamaica, probably the largest of our English-speaking Caribbean countries. Karan, you are in Trinidad and Tobago. Both Genevieve and I are in Barbados. Fairly small places in the scheme of things, and I get the sense from what Genevieve said, Therese, that we have to think about how we come together to work together. And you mentioned this, and Kiran has mentioned this as well. And that statement that happened way back when we were trying to do the federation, the 1 from 10 leaves 0. Every time I think about it, I think I wake up with a cold sweat, and I think, what a missed opportunity. But Therese, is CARICOM?
Yeah,
CARICOM dead? What can we do? What can we do? Can we get regionalism back on its feet?
Oh boy. I think we have to do it in so many different ways. So first of all, it's on the one hand, it's not that complicated because we've been working at it for such a long time. So we know what actually we need to do at the national level and at the regional level. But on the other hand, maybe what we need to do is turn it upside down, meaning every citizen, I think, of this region sees themselves as Caribbean. And we're very much dedicated to being part of this cultural heritage that we share. And it's especially strong when, of course, when we leave the region and we live somewhere else, and I say I'm from the Bahamas and they think it's somewhere in Jamaica, or you're from Barbados and they say, oh, where's that? Is that part of Jamaica? For the rest of the world, our little individual pieces don't really mean that much. It only means something to us because xenophobia is alive and well in every single country, and I think with every single leader. What's lacking is a movement that says, I'm a Bahamian, but I feel as Guyanese as the people born in Georgetown. And I should feel like if I want to live in Barbados, I should be able to do that. I'm a Jamaican, I want to move to Ghana, I should be able to do that. Clearly, it's not that easy, right? Because we would have done it already.
Yes.
What I think we need is this has to be a bottoms-up approach, because what we're seeing after all these decades is that at the leadership level, it's just not there. I think in those CARICOM meetings when they're all sitting around the table and they're singing the praises of CARICOM and they're signing the communique. I mean, those words mean a lot in those settings. They go back to their headquarters and poof, that's the last we hear until the next July when there's another meeting. We have to break that cycle. And I think breaking that cycle is a mindset change. So until every single person in this region starts to value the whole over the individual, it's not going to change. And why I say mindset change is because I think it's basically mindset that's keeping us in this trap we're in of individualism versus regionalism. Now, how do you get there? So we can rally around big issues, right? So we have COVID-19, which is something to rally around. We have climate change, which is something to rally around. We have the lack of competitiveness in our region, which is something to rally around. And if these moments in history don't cause us to rise up and say, okay, now is the time, whether it's because we want to have access to vaccines or whether we want to have access to the best online education for our children, because so many thousands of children around this region now are absolutely not learning, and that's a crisis. Whether it's finding out how we can weatherize the Caribbean, that word that they're using in Texas today, to make sure that the next hurricane, like Dorian, does not devastate an entire island and set of people. We have to figure out how big does the crisis have to be for us to say, all right, maybe it's time for us to get together. What I do know from working in a multilateral institution now for most of my career is that cooperation, collaboration, multilateralism, globalization is the way forward. It can't be that Barbados does it on its own, the Bahamas does it on its own, St. Lucia tries to do it on its own. It does not work. It's not going to work for all the reasons we know. And all of the trade theories coming out of WTO and our own institutions, CARICOM, we know it doesn't work. I don't know what else is going to drive us to say we all need to gather around the table and sort it out as leaders. But I'm hoping maybe the mindset that every single person living in this region says, it's time that we start thinking that I'm a Caribbean person. I'm not a Bahamian. I'm a Caribbean person, which is basically how I carry myself now. Until we all take on that identity and start to push our politicians in that direction, it's not going to change, sadly. We need that.
Yeah. Well, this is Caribbean Bridges, and I am Justin Ram with you this evening. So, Therese, you just mentioned, I think, a new approach that we have to consider if we want to become one as a region, which is a bottom-up approach. So we really need to empower our people. One of the ways I think that we can do that is if we encourage much more economic freedom, free market liberalism, which I really think is what we need and which really empowers many more people to feel as if they have a voice and ownership within their own economies. Now, Kiran, I know that you're a free market economist like I am. I said earlier that you're a fellow libertarian, so we're part of that libertarian conspiracy. Now, I'm always reminded by a past American president who said that the most terrifying 9 words in the English language is, "I'm from the government and I've come to help." Now, I know that that's a little bit extreme. And I only say it in this, but when you think about where we are, and you as an entrepreneur, what's the new role for government in our region? What should the government be doing?
Well, Justin, thank you very much for that question. It's one that I would be excited about, but I have to draw on what sort of Therese was saying just now, because it's absolutely critical right now. I think you and I, everyone, for example, on this webinar, would be sort of very aligned that, look, I mean, there is a place for regulation, but regulation should be enabling. It should be something that is there to catalyze innovation, to support business, to support free enterprise. You know, well, for example, Therese talked about telehealth, right? But for example, even right now, our challenge is not the technology. Technology is there. But for example, right now, if a doctor is practicing in Jamaica, they can't practice in Trinidad. If a doctor is practicing Barbados, they can't practice in Guyana. We're a very, very small region. It should be a snap of the finger. Likewise, if a drug is approved in Jamaica, it can't be approved in Trinidad. Why can't we have a situation where literally sort of much more harmonization of regulations? Why can't a doctor simply sort of prescribe and work anywhere in the region? But then that goes back to what Therese is saying, and this is where perhaps there's a gap between, I think, you know, folks like us and many of the people that we know and talk to, where to some extent, I mean, I am very guilty, and I'm the first person to be guilty of it, of almost being in this like liberal bubble. You know, even sort of, I'm reading some of the comments here, and I couldn't help but notice that, you know, literally while folks are talking about sort of, you know, regional integration and so and sort of liberal ideals and enabling trade and technology, many of the comments were really focusing on sort of very, I would say, nationalism, and I think we have to respect. You know, we can't sort of dismiss these views because I think we've seen that has happened and resulted in this tide of populism that John was talking about, right? I mean, we can't dismiss it. We have to say, okay, this exists. This is how folks think. That is how Tanti is, you know, coming in, and you know, she's like, you know, I don't really, you know, feel these Trinis should be coming in here, kind of thing. We need to be able to engage with this and say, okay, well, hang on. Because I do really believe that once people are put next to each other, and you see that whenever a Trini and a Guyanese is in London, for example, they're all of a sudden they're linemen, you know. But it really is about how can we communicate this, acknowledge people's concerns as well. Otherwise, I believe, Justin, unless we radically rethink it, the cause of liberalism, as much as I hate to say it, it will be dead.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point, and I think you're quite right. We have to take on board the concerns of all of our people across the region, and it sounds to me like we need to do a better job on communication and on education as well. So we've got our work cut out, but I think I come back to what Therese said about it has to be a bottom-up approach. We have to, as people, start to drive this and say this is the way we want to go, and this is what we want to see the outcomes to be. Now, Johnny, I'm coming back to you again. I mean, we have just been speaking about the need for this bottom-up approach. What's the role of government, free markets, for example? But we live in a bad neighborhood. Let's be honest. We are very vulnerable to all sorts of things. In particular, Mother Nature, where we have these storms coming through every year. Our economies are vulnerable. Tell me something, Jenny. With your experience in trade, how can trade help us become much more resilient?
Yes, thanks for that question. I mean, just to step back a little bit from what was just discussed, which is the bottom-up approach, I I have heard so many cries for greater integration. That honestly, I don't think that's what we're missing, is that everybody knows that's what we have to do, and it just has to happen. I don't think the advocacy is missing. I think, when we think about a sub-region like the OECS and the fact that at that level, there's not even a question about integrating, and it is facilitated obviously by the fact that we have a common currency and, a commission and all of these things that push the agenda. It says to me, as the others were saying, that it is a mindset, because it is certainly possible within the smaller sub-region, and it's not even questioned, that is how we have to operate in order to survive and in order to thrive as economies. So it does, bring back the point that the model that we have chosen at CARICOM, which is intergovernmental, and, OECS is much more of a supranational kind of entity, needs some rethinking, but we're stuck with the model that we have right now. And I think there are some very encouraging signs based on what we saw with COVID, that when the region does need to come together, it will. We just need to see this follow through. On the specific question about trade and free trade and libertarian approaches to trade, I obviously am not a supporter of unfettered markets. I think the WTO does not even assert itself to be. I mean, even the biggest countries hold on to certain levels of protectionism, as we see every time we look at the stimulus packages and the subsidies that are provided in the United States. So there's never a case, and even built into the rules is an understanding that sometimes countries will need, out of other interests, to protect their markets. Obviously, that's the exception, but these things are allowed. Now, the Caribbean faces a very specific challenge, one of vulnerability, and this is a very big kind of advocacy piece that we have in all outside of trade, in all the IFIs, that because of our environmental and our economic and our social vulnerabilities, somehow we need some kind of special dispensation in the rules. So, access to concessionary financing should not be limited only to countries with very low GDP per capita, but in light of our vulnerabilities, Caribbean countries should be treated, with the same kind of generosity of spirit as some of the other countries that are low income. Now, thinking about it in an economic environment, and thinking about the ways that we would utilize that vulnerability index in order to assert our relative vulnerability, relative to other countries, we have been making the case very clearly before the IMFs and the World Banks, etc. I think at the WTO, it's a little bit of a more nuanced approach, because the WTO recognizes special and differential treatment, and that has come under some attack. And so we would put forward vulnerability as an alternative to the way that traditionally special and differential treatment has been accorded, which is just by a self-selection process. So how do we actually make that trade vulnerability issue translate into policies where countries treat us being cognizant of these vulnerabilities that we face? And I think beyond just explaining as an explanatory force that because of our vulnerabilities, we may have a harder time accepting certain obligations. We may need longer transition periods. Apart from that, it certainly is the case that we bring that to bear much more in our negotiations at the WTO, in terms of all of the new obligations that are being thrust upon us in the context of the new mandates at the WTO. And I think it's really, to try to galvanize and think about ways that the rules that are supposed to be leveling for everybody recognize that we are particularly vulnerable, and that makes it much more difficult for us sometimes to accord with our international obligations. And there should be some kind of reckoning with that reality, even in the trade context, outside of just the IFI context.
Okay, wonderful. So we're almost at the end of the program, and before I come to the last set of questions, I just really want to ask all three of you together, given that we know that to get back to some level of normalcy, we need to vaccinate. And I think we did touch on this a bit. But I think Karen and I had estimated that we're going to need maybe about $1 billion to try to vaccinate. And I just heard, of course, Jean-Yves speak about we need to have access to concessional resources, although we're middle and high income countries. Could each of you just give me an idea of what you think about how can we go about paying for these vaccines? Because I think a lot of our viewers would be really interested to understand how that can happen. I'll ask you first, Therese.
What's already on the table for us is that for all the members of the IDB, and so in the English-speaking side, we have all the countries: Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname, Belize, Haiti are IDB members. And what the IDB has offered to each of its members is to use some of the undisbursed balances that we have. So just to give you one example, in Jamaica, there are over $220 million of undisbursed balances from the current portfolio. So Jamaica has a large portfolio, but in other countries, there are similar sums of money that have already been approved by the bank. But if Jamaica or Bahamas or Barbados or whoever wanted to use those resources to buy vaccines, why, great, we'll help you do that. And they know that. Of all the countries who've taken up that offer, it's Trinidad, it's Bahamas, and it's Belize so far. The others haven't responded to financing their vaccines that way, and for whatever reasons that they have. But so resources are there. I want to say that the financing, Justin, is not the issue. Financing is not the issue. It may be an issue, even in the case of Eastern Caribbean countries. There may be a facility through CDB to help them, but I don't think financing is really what's holding the vaccine back. As we talked about earlier in this conversation, it's about, what we paid for at the beginning, what was the down payment. Now we realize there's a huge gap, 9% of the population is still not covered. How do we have access to a supply of vaccines for those 90% of the population? I think that's the issue. I think the financing part is easily solved. I know you had an idea about floating a bond. I don't think that's necessary. I think resources are already approved and sitting around, and countries just need to take the next step and say, okay, IDB, I would love you to take 20 million here and help us buy these vaccines. So I think for us, that would be a good response. I think the bond issue would get complicated. It's a regional bond. We've not done that before. It could be complicated.
Okay. Maybe we could think about that for something else during our recovery. But so it sounds as if money is available, and I'm just really conscious of time. And I'm actually going to start wrapping up now and just asking each of you, thinking about the Caribbean economy and in the future, knowing that we're now all highly dependent on either commodities or on tourism. What does the future Caribbean economy look like? And I'm probably going to ask you if you could just keep your responses maybe to about 30 seconds or so each. Let me ask you first, Janive, to take that.
I think we've had that discussion over the last hour about the economy has to look green or blue, but it certainly has to be digitized. Mm-hmm. I think the blue and the green, investing in the things that we have in natural supply in great quantities. All around us we have sun, we have wind, we have the ocean economy to exploit sustainably. So I think it's really about the education system and ensuring that the people that we are educating and the people that we are throwing out there are able to utilize the technology available to them to sustainably exploit the resources that are all around us. And I think that has to be the way forward for our economies.
Right. Kiran, what are your thoughts?
Well, there are two sides of it. In 15 seconds, there are two paths we could take. One path is the current path, which we have been going down, and that is a part of a dramatically continued decline, rising debt to GDP, and mass emigration, coupled with very slow stagnation and decline, if we just keep continuing what we're doing now. And the second path is if we genuinely take COVID-19 and stop talking about getting back to normal and start talking about totally and radically and structurally changing every single way we do things and start problem solving and engaging with technology. Those are the two paths. The road is before us. Which one we'll take, I don't know. I'm strongly pushing for the second one, as I know is everyone on this panel, and there are others too. So,
okay, great.
Still hopeful, still optimistic.
Therese, very quickly.
Agile, digital, green, orange, blue. We just need to move. And everything Kiran said, all of the above, as well as Janive, I think we know what to do, and there's no turning back. There's no pre-COVID life. It's going to be whatever life brings from here on out. We have to adapt.
Right. All right. Well, look, I want to really thank each of you for spending your Saturday evening with me. Thank you, Therese. Thank you, Janive. Thank you, Kiran. This has been a wonderful discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Caribbean Bridges, and I am Justin Ram. I have been hosting this discussion this Saturday evening with you. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Also, check out justinram.com when you can. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Good night.